This is a Sportsman 1000 Highlifter Edition, and I'm going to show you why the Highlifter bracket lift kit is a bad idea for the front driveline. So now I'm looking at the suspension on this thing. Richard wanted me to install this Highlifter bracket lift. I tried installing the same one on my Highlifter back in the day, and I had issues with the axle binding, and the same issues are present here. So this lift gives you a lot more axle angle. If you look at where the axle's sitting now, it's at a pretty steep angle. If you try to turn it, you see how the control arm bounces up and falls down? That's because the axle is maxed out. You're actually having the shaft contact the outer CV joint cup. That is unacceptable. The only way to run this lift would be to run a limiting strap to keep it up here where the axle's not binding, right? That's binding a little bit right there even. But at full down travel, it binds up badly. This differential is very susceptible to damage from a binding axle because it's not a regular differential, it's a Hillard, and it has these two rollers in there that if they get cocked sideways, it can just wreak all kinds of havoc on your differential. You'll see some guys with Highlifters that are running this bracket lift, when they do a water wheelie in two-wheel drive, their front end will engage all of a sudden, and that's because the axle is dropping down, pushing on the CV joint cup, causing the front differential to bind and engage. It's not the engagement mechanism Highlifter intended, and it's bad for the diff. So I really don't recommend running these bracket lifts. Okay, so I added this ratchet strap here to limit how far the suspension can drop down, and I played with it to see when the axle would start to bind. That is as far as I would want it to go. And you can see the shock really is not far from its factory location. There is not much extra down travel in the factory CV joint. If you want more down travel than this, more lift in the front, you got to go to an aftermarket CV joint. Otherwise, weird stuff's going to happen. What you have to keep in mind is that when you steer, the steering also changes where the shaft is in the cup, and that's going to make it bind more or less. So you've got to make sure that you have full range of travel with the steering and no binding. This Highlifter lift kit is a little too big. So if I was going to run this bracket lift, I would actually, it's supposed to be like this obviously, I would flip it around like this. That gives you the right amount of down travel and it'll give you a little bit of lift. The problem is it's going to want to rock. So what I would do is I'd put it like this and then either tack weld it to your upper control arm once your warranty's out. That'd be the best way to do it. Or drill a hole and put another bolt and nut and washer down here to stabilize the bracket, and then you can trim this part of it off. Okay, I've got the brackets on, right? They just make the shock longer basically, and they put a lot more angle on the CV joints. These factory stock CVs cannot handle that much angle. I'm going to show you the symptom. You see that? So we're in two-wheel drive. We're in two-wheel drive and the front tire is spinning. You can see the rotor bouncing up and down. That's a surefire way to tell if an axle is going to bind. So looking at the rear suspension here, I hooked the back shock, and as you can see, the rear suspension has a lot more extra down travel you can add before the CV joints will bind. The rear axles can take a lot more angle the way they're made, and also the rear differential isn't really differential. There's just a ring and pinion in there, so it's not as sensitive to side loading. So if there is a little bit of binding in the rear at full down travel, probably not as big of a deal. Also, the rear is not going to reach full down travel as often, most likely, because you're probably not doing reverse wheelies as much. Water wheelies is where I had issues with the front reaching full down travel. But yeah, so you can definitely put this bracket lift on the rear. Let me show you what it looks like. So there's the rear bracket. You can see it just brings the shock out. So you could really have, you can bring the shock out as far as you want, and you're not really going to have binding issues. So I think this rear lift is good. It'll add some stiffness to the rear because these springs really aren't all that stiff. So definitely want to run this, but in the front, you got to get a little more creative. I would not install the lift as is.